Hello, folks. We're live. Hi. You are all watching us on various devices in various places around the planet. Thank you for being Slate Plus subscribers. You get to basically listen to this week's podcast Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3 days early because that's how fabulous you are. Thank you. And you get to participate. You get to type in all of your questions. I am Felix Salmon of Axios. Anna Szymanski, say hi.
Hello.
Emily Peck, say hi.
Hello.
There is someone else here. There is by far the most fabulous person here is the amazing Margaret Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan is also here. She has got an amazing book which you can read, which we're going to talk about. And you are going to basically see how the sausage is made, the random circumlocutions and retakes that happen in all podcasts. You're going to get to see behind the scenes of all that. You're going to see what a real podcast taping looks like. And you're going to learn the big dirty secret of Slate Money, which is that we actually record our introductions at the end once we know what we have talked about so that I can have a vague idea of what I can introduce. So we are going to jump straight in as though you know who Margaret is, but Margaret Sullivan needs no introduction. So we will do the introduction at the end. Margaret, you have this amazing book. Congratulations on its publication. It
Thank
is
you.
like many of the Columbia Global Reports books. We've had a few of the authors on this show. We love them because they are short.
Yes, it is. It packs a punch, I hope, in 105 printed pages. So it is.
What does that work out
as,
to in terms of?
It's described as novella length. So that might give you an idea.
How long
is
a novella? Fiction.
Well, 105, I guess.
In words?
No, in words. 35,000 words.
You see, I ask this not just because I'm rambling, although I do ramble in unedited conversations. I ask this because 35,000 words, I think, is roughly the number of words that you would find in terms of editorial content in a daily newspaper.
Oh, I don't know, Felix.
It's about, I'm just going to like orders of magnitude. It's in that range. A daily newspaper has about 35,000 words, and you can buy it at any newsstand for what, like a couple bucks, something like this. You can buy Margaret Sullivan's amazing book at any good local bookstore for $15.99. But that kind of explains one of the problems with local news, right? Which is that it's really hard to persuade lots of people to pay actual money for 35,000 words of content, even though it's an enormous amount of work to put all of that together.
Yeah, well, the whole problem with the decline of local news, which is what my book is about, and the book is pitched shamelessly at millennials and those younger, because the title of it is Ghosting the News, so I try to put a sort of dating word in there. At any rate, it's about the abrupt or not so abrupt abandonment of the news by traditional media, not because they wanted to, but because the business model disintegrated over a number of years. And it took a particular fall in just recent months during the COVID pandemic, because, as you know, it kind of kicked the legs out from under the economy and certainly from under whatever advertising was supporting these places. So it's been a really tough time, which makes the book more timely, but also even more tragic.
What I think is so
you're
great
really
about...
concentrating on the newspapers here. Like when you say local news, you do cover the TV stations and the radio stations,
absolutely.
But like the heart of it is newspapers.
Yes, but I mean, I certainly treat with TV stations, radio, and particularly with the new, nonprofit digital sites. Not all of them are nonprofit, but a lot of them are nonprofit. The sort of prototypical one would be the Texas Tribune in Austin, which has recently sort of joined forces with ProPublica, which is kind of like the most famous of these of these digital investigative sites, and that's a huge part of the media ecosystem these days. But if you get into cities and towns of a moderate size, the newspaper has been very, very important, and used to have a newsroom of maybe 300 people where you could send somebody out to every meeting, and now they're down to 40 people, some of whom are editors and producers, and 10 of them are reporters, and you can't actually cover the area anymore, and that's the problem.
And maybe we could also take a step back and kind of explain, so why is local news so important?
So, I think for two major reasons. And one of the reasons that a lot of people kind of can think of is to restrain corruption in public officials. If they know that somebody is watching, or if someone can look at a budget and say, that looks pretty weird to me, I think I'll file a Freedom of Information request and dig down into it and hold this public official accountable, and if necessary, shame and embarrass him on the website or in our pages. So that's sort of the watchdog role. But the other part that's, I think, really important, but not maybe as well acknowledged or understood, is its role in kind of being the village square for a community, the place where people manage to get a similar set of facts. They might disagree about what to do with those facts, but where they can see about a new restaurant, you see the review of a concert, find out, read a feature story, read an obituary. All these things that kind of knit the community together is a role that the media plays, certainly, but in localities, it's been traditionally the newspaper, and now much, much less so. And I will just say, I know we're not on the numbers round yet, but since 2004, from 2004 to 2019, more than 2,000 newspapers in the United States went out of business, closed their doors. A lot of them were weeklies, but some were dailies.
Talking about numbers, okay, so just give, put that in perspective. 2,000 is, I wouldn't have guessed that there were 2,000 newspapers, but how many newspapers are there?
There are, I think, around 7,000 left. So, the base was something like 9 or 10,000 in 2004. Now it's much less. And actually, that only takes us up to 2019. And as I just said, 2020 has been a horrible year for newspapers. Now, these could also be alternative papers. They could be weeklies. They're not all the Cleveland Plain Dealer, for example.
The other number that really jumped out at me from your book was, apropos the local corruption and whatnot, that local governments have significantly and measurably lower borrowing costs if there is a local newspaper, just because the governments can get up to fewer shenanigans.
Exactly. And now this thing is not, what I'm going to say next is not a number, but it's really interesting to know that people become much less civically engaged when there's in a news desert, a place where there's not much local news. They don't vote as much. And when they do vote, they vote in a very polarized way, like they don't cross the aisle. They're kind of over here or over there. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but the subject excites me. What can I say?
No, you're supposed to be talking a lot.
Okay, good.
I just wanted to say, the subtitle of your book is Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. And I felt like it was really illuminating to me to just read about how important local news is to informing voters and its civic role. I heard John Thornton, who's the investor in the Texas Tribune, talking about Americans have 4 needs that they're getting met from media. One is your needs as a consumer. One is your needs as a worker, your needs as an audience member, like entertainment. And then the fourth prong is needs as a voter. And the first 3 are getting met pretty well still through media. We talked last week about the streaming wars and all the places you can watch stuff. But that fourth need, the needs of voters, is really, the decline in local news is really doing a huge disservice to everyone. And you have that powerful example I was hoping you could talk about Chris Collins in Western New York and what happened there. I think it was really fascinating and sad.
Okay, so Chris Collins was the first congressman to endorse Donald Trump big Trump advocate and fan and supporter. He, his congressional district was, and I'm using the past tense because Chris Collins was indicted on insider trading charges, was, went through the whole judicial process and was sentenced to prison not too long ago. But after he was arrested and indicted, but before he, came to trial, he had to stand for re-election. And my former colleague in Buffalo, where I was the editor for 12 years, is the Washington correspondent. And he broke a big piece of the Chris Collins insider trading story. And so the people who, were tuned into the Buffalo News and other, parts of the urban core were pretty affected by this news. And they, the district is really heavily red. It's heavily Republican. But it ended up that Collins did win re-election, but by a whisker. He won by less than 0.5%. And the places that were stalwart supporters of his in the election were places that were not unserved, but less served by local news. Places where newspapers had gone out of business. There are some small but good websites in these areas, in these more rural areas, but there isn't as much local news. And those were the places where the guy who ran against Collins, this guy named Nate McMurray, told me that he would go out to these, rural districts, and people in some cases weren't even aware that their own congressman had been indicted. And he said that they were getting their news, largely, not entirely, but largely from sort of, their Facebook pages, talk radio, gossip, as he put it. And, he drew a strong connection between the much more informed reader, and maybe this was self-serving on his part, the much more informed reader who voted for him, the less informed reader, as he saw it, who stayed, within party lines and voted for Collins. So I don't think you could say, it is a powerful example. It's not, a black and white example, but I think one of the counties that's affected has been termed a news desert by the University of North Carolina, which, has studied this. And it's in New York State, it's pretty rare to have a news desert, but Orleans County, which is in this district, is one of them, despite the fact that it has something called Orleans Hub, which has pointed itself out to me in recent days as we're here. But, I think there's a tie here. And it does speak to what you're talking about, that, citizens have this need to know what's going on. And sometimes it's hard to know, it's like you don't know what you don't know sometimes. It's like if there isn't local news out there and being presented to you in a way that's really visible, it's possible you wouldn't know that your own congressman had been indicted.
And that's the national politics. The one thing which I feel is super important when it comes to local news is just picking between local candidates should really have nothing to do with what party they are. Fiorello LaGuardia, the famous mayor of New York, said there's no Republican or Democratic way of taking out the trash. Mayors and local officials, run on very local issues, and those local issues just are basically entirely orthogonal to national left-right things. Like the mayor neither wants nor needs to have an opinion about foreign policy. It's like this is something where you vote for an individual based on who that individual is, what their character is, how they're going to interact with the people in the community. And the amazingly powerful way of getting that across is through the local media. And in the absence of reliable local media, people wind up using this very, very unhelpful heuristic in order to determine who they want to vote for, which is just, are they a Republican or are they a Democrat? And it's just
right.
A really silly way of voting for local officials.
That's right. And I think that is largely what happened in this particular case. And it's a cautionary tale. So, as these places go out of business or shrink, become ghost newspapers that still exist but have much less staff. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a lot more of this. And, people will be relying on sources of information that are not only less accurate, I would say, but also less trusted. People do say they hate and mistrust the national media, but they actually have significantly more trust in local media of all sorts.
Right. But I guess one of the things I wonder is, people say they love local media and they want local news, but they're not necessarily willing to pay for it. And I also kind of wonder how much of this also has to do with the fact that for so many years, newspapers kind of underpriced their product and subscribers were subsidized by advertisers. And obviously now that's not the case. So it makes people kind of even less apt to want to pay the real price of what it costs to produce this.
Yeah, that's very true, and absolutely. And so for the longest time, it was like advertising was sort of 2/3 of the revenue stream, and subscriptions or purchases of the paper were about 1/3. But as advertising has dwindled, let's take the New York Times. The New York Times now, much more of their revenue is coming from the reader in one form or another. Mostly as digital subscriptions, but. And then, to add to that, the other thing that happened was as newspapers made this very clumsy transition to the internet, there was this whole discussion about, should we charge for the website? Should we have a paywall? Should we actually ask people to subscribe so they can read the website? And the answer for a long time was no, we should not, which did not make any sense because people were saying, well, I don't actually have to subscribe to the paper and pay. I can just go on the website and read the same stuff. So now we have paywalls, but we've trained people to think that it should be free. I would say overall, there haven't been a lot of great decisions.
That was my question to you. Was the decline of newspapers completely inevitable, or did they kind of like cock it up?
Some of it was foisted upon them. You can't argue with the internet. You can't say that, for example, that, classified advertising was a big source of revenue and then Craigslist came along. That is hard to fight against, but could these organizations have been a lot more nimble in taking advantage of the strengths of the internet and figuring out how smartly to get some money out of it? Yeah, definitely a lot more. There was a smugness, I think, and a complacency that came from long period of time where, the profit margins were like 30%, literally 35%. And so it was sort of like it didn't require a whole lot of financial acumen to make money at newspapering for a long time.
Well, then I guess
so
also
let me finish. Let's wrap up this segment here, because we're going to keep on local news, but we're just going to open a new segment here. And for all of you guys who are tuning in live, do keep your questions coming, both for Margaret about local news, but also in general. We have an entire segment coming up where we're just going to be answering questions about absolutely anything you want to ask us. So drop those in the chat. I want to get to the news of the week, which is the big takeover out of bankruptcy of a massive newspaper chain called McClatchy by a hedge fund called Chatham. There are two big evil hedge funds in your book. Chatham is one of them. The other one is called Alden, which is even eviler, if that's a word. Alden Capital is the owner that everybody in news media loves to hate. And I have to admit that I don't understand how this works. Like, hedge funds are people who famously want to make enormous amounts of money and, spend a little bit amount of money and then get back 10 or 20 times what they put in, that kind of thing. And newspapers are notoriously dreadful investments. So how is it that these hedge funds are managing to outbid all of the do-gooders and buy these properties and wind up putting together these empires of like low quality journalism? How do they manage to do that? How did they make money doing that?
Well, I think I can answer that. They make money by strip mining. So what a lot of these smaller papers are still profitable or still capable of being profitable at this point. A lot of them, by the way, are in big, historically, they've been in the same big, impressive building for a long time. So the hedge fund or its management comes in and says, well, that was then and this is now, and we're actually going to sell your wonderful old building for a lot of money because it's in a prime location. And by the way, we're going to trim your staff to the bone and continue to, take the advertising and subscription money that's left, all with an eye to sort of next quarter's balance sheet, not with an eye to sustaining journalism into the next, decade. So it's very short-sighted, and it's it's got a bit of a fire sale aspect to it.
And
I guess I'm wondering.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Anna.
I was just gonna say, do you think there actually is any intention to, create a new model that could work, or do you think this is just funds that understand, look, this industry is dying, there's still some value there, I'm going to take that value, it's going to die anyway?
The latter. They talk. Some of them kind of talk a good game about we're very interested in the future of journalism, but if you're interested in the future of journalism, you will not be cutting the newsroom staff to the bone, because that's where the journalism gets done after all. So I think you've got it nailed with your second choice there.
Yeah, I think the idea was a sort of economies of scale model, right? If you own a huge number of newspapers, then, I don't know, they can all run the same crossword or something. But the fact is that there isn't a lot of economy of scale. That someone in North Carolina really is not interested in the local news from Wisconsin. And so you do need the local reporters. And if you fire them, you get what we have this question here from someone who, quote, lived in a lot of small towns in different states. And most people are incredibly critical of the paper. It's almost a local pastime to make fun of the paper and the errors and the typos. Presumably all of these errors and typos are a function of the underinvestment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now I'm out at my family's cottage in Western New York, which is on Lake Erie. And I get, as soon as I get here, I subscribe to the Buffalo News, which I was the editor of for 12 years. And I will say that it's still a very good product. It is not full of typos and errors. It just isn't. They still do a good job. They were owned by Warren Buffett until last year, and managed to keep their staff up. Now they're owned by a big chain called Lee Enterprises. I mean, you can't really make a sweeping statement about all of these papers. Some are better than others. Some are very good. Some are very bad. And where their quality has gone down to the point where there's typos and errors, that's absolute death knell for these places, because at some point, even the most loyal, well-intentioned person is going to say, you know what, I think I'll just watch cable news.
What are, is the some answer? Of the models that... Go ahead, Anna.
I was going to say, so then is the answer that you just need Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos? You just kind of need your somewhat benevolent billionaire?
Well, it was Warren Buffett, right?
Warren Buffett just sold off all his papers. Right. I mean, Buffett was a very good owner of the Buffalo News, but never in the sense of philanthropy. He didn't need us to make 30% profit margins, but he did not want to subsidize. And I would say that's true even of Patrick Soon-Shiong in Los Angeles, who bought the LA Times. But and to some extent, I think probably of Jeff Bezos, who, when he bought the Washington Post for $250 million only, he said that what he wanted to do for the Post was to give it runway. So he wanted to give it the time and the space and the money to figure out the new model, which I think we have done. But the Post is not a local newspaper. It's national.
Although it was kind of drifting in that direction before Bezos bought it.
Absolutely. And it wasn't doing well.
I'm very, very happy that you're at the Washington Post. You're doing amazing stuff there. But we do have a question. I'm going to drag you back to your former job as New York Times public editor. And so just place yourself in that chair for 1 minute and give us the official New York Times public editor.
I'm having some sort of physical reaction to that, but okay. My blood pressure has just jolted up, but okay.
Did you, I need to ask you, when you were the New York Times public editor, how many New York Times Slacks were you on? Were you in the newsroom Slack? Were you in the opinion Slack?
I was pre-Slack. I mean, I left there
in
2016.
Pre-Slack.
Well, it's not that long. It's not ancient history. I left there in mid 2016. But if Slack was happening then, I wasn't on any of it. And it would have been, I think it would have been pretty inappropriate for me to, I don't think the public editor would be on Slack and inside. But I did, maybe this sounds retro now, but I would get calls from inside the newsroom, from like someone would go into someone would go into a conference room so their call couldn't be traced. And they would say, you should know about this thing that's happening. And so it would be like a hot tip from inside the building. It was great.
That sounds so amazing.
I even sent, I don't know that I've told this story before, but I always had a great assistant. The assistants at the New York Times are like, they could run the place. They're like 25, but they're highly accomplished people, could run the place, or will probably someday. And at one point, I sent my assistant out to a street corner to pick up a bag of material that someone had wanted, someone inside the paper wanted me to have because they thought it was important for me to know about something that was happening.
Full on dead letter, like spycraft thing going on.
Yeah, it's exciting. It was exciting.
This is amazing.
So the big scandal at the New York Times this week is, of course, the Slack bullying, or the alleged Slack bullying of Barry Weiss, who left in a blaze of I don't know what you would call it, public resignation letter. And what's your opinion of Barry Weiss and her resignation? And Emily, maybe you can give us the quick TLDR view of this for the very, very smart people who are listening to this who have no idea what I'm talking about.
Right. I was just going to say you should mention that Barry Weiss was an editor on the editorial side of the New York Times who mostly commissioned and edited pieces from contributors and occasionally wrote her own pieces, and was often a target of controversy and Twitter trolling for her views, which she would describe as centrist, but especially on Israel, people objected to a lot of the things she said. And she also, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, coined the term intellectual dark web for certain academics.
Jordan Peterson and those guys, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think are like misogynist trolls, but whatever. She called them the intellectual dark web. So that's who she is. She resigned this week and wrote this big letter and said that she was being bullied by her colleagues. At the time, someone had put an axe next to her name on Slack, which does sound bad, but I don't know. That's what happened. And, the usual Twitter fuss ensued.
Well, it strikes me as like another example of something that if it happened anywhere else, no one would care one bit. But because it happens at the New York Times, it's elevated into this kind of, extremely important, like almost Armageddon-like situation. This is a little bit of an offshoot, but for quite a while when I was at the Times, I would get a lot of complaints from readers about the Middle East coverage. You're being the paper's being far too pro-Israel, or why are you paying attention to the Palestinians at all? It was very, very volatile on both sides, and I didn't want to write about it because I knew it was like a complete. You could just never, ever possibly, get anywhere with it or win. But I did talk with one editor at the Times about this, and he said that a lot of people have the idea that if they could just fix the Middle East coverage at the New York Times in the way that they wanted it fixed, there would be peace in the Middle East. And so I think that there's a little bit of that syndrome going on here, where anything that happens at the Times gets elevated into this kind of, insane thing. I mean, of course, it's terrible if someone was being bullied. I don't know that she was. She says she was. Axes are not nice. So, but I do, this is all part of this larger discussion about who gets a platform and who gets to talk and which voices are being magnified and which voices are being silenced. And I don't know, it seems to me that if you're an editor and a columnist at the New York Times, she resigned. She wasn't forced to resign. She had a pretty nice way to get her point of view out there. And so I also think that the idea that somehow centrism is not represented on the New York Times editorial page is simply not the case. I mean, it really, the editorial page, whether op-eds or editorially, kind of runs the gamut from center left to center right. So I don't think there's a big problem there. And I guess I would say too that I guess I think that it's all part of this whole thing about the discourse. Who gets to talk, who's being canceled, and Barry Weiss, I believe, canceled herself. So I'm not sure that qualifies. So those are some random thoughts.
One question I had is, like today there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that was about how people who make like $400,000 a year should be very scared right now because their taxes could go up, and it had like an illustration of like pigs in a house clutching bags of money, and those were the good guys. And then I was just thinking how like the Wall Street Journal's editorial page is so bad, but there's never any of these dust-ups like you see at the Times. Is it just because people have higher expectations?
No, I bet anything there are these dust-ups. It's just no one cares about them. There's probably all sorts of, I bet there's all kinds of drama happening within the opinion pages of the New York Times and the opinion staff. It's just that, people don't, for whatever reason, people find what happens at the Times extremely fascinating. So
there is this bizarre thing. There is only one op-ed page that anyone cares about, and I've never quite worked out why that's the case.
One thing I wanted to just kind of ask about is like somewhat the rise of advocacy journalism, because it does seem like, especially in the last 4 years, in some of the largest national newspapers, that the line between straight journalism and op-ed does seem to be getting a little blurred. It does seem like journalists are really speaking with a voice, and I guess you could make arguments on either side of that, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is the whole...
Anna, just be clear. When you say like the rise of, I mean, obviously Slate has been doing that since it started in 1997. Are you saying that you're beginning to see that in places where you used not to see it? And where are you talking about in particular?
Primarily the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Okay.
and the Washington Post, to be fair. I mean, like it's you very often read articles that it's very, very clear the politics of the person who wrote the article. And I may agree with those politics, but whether I should be able to see that so clearly in an article that's in theory not an op-ed is something that I've definitely noticed more in the last few years.
Yeah. Well, I think part of what's happened there is that, the Times and others like it, if there is anything like it, have to differentiate themselves somehow from sort of the straight ahead Associated Press coverage of something that everybody has. So how can they do that? Well, they can do it through sort of more analytical writing. And I think that often, you'll see an analysis piece, for example, by, Peter Baker today, covering Trump's press conference. It had a pretty analytical, it had a pretty voicey feel to it. And Peter Baker he's a straight ahead reporter. He's not a columnist. So I think that's part of what's happened. I think the other part of what lends itself to the feeling you have about it, which is not unfounded, is that, how do we absorb news? We absorb news on our phones. How does it come to us? Well, it comes to us often in social media, or maybe we go to the website, maybe we go to the app, whatever. But it's kind of coming to us in this disaggregated way. And so you don't really know, is this thing I'm reading, which may well be a column or may well be a piece of, analysis. You don't really know. It's not like the old days where you're turning the pages of the paper and you got to the editorial page and you knew that was opinion. The rest of it was supposed to be news. So I think this kind of fire hose, and it's not very well labeled, lends itself to the idea that, oh my God, there's just so much opinion out there. But it may well be that the opinion is, in fact, an op-ed piece, an editorial, a column, or something else mixed in with the news coverage. And the news coverage has probably gotten to be more interpretive too.
I would add two things to that. One is what you were just previously talking about, the discourse, which is the most boring conversation in the world, and we'll try not to spend too much time on it. But a lot of what people used to consider to be impartial journalism was really partial in very unexamined ways and biased towards a certain sort of white elite. And as you get more voices coming in and seeing the world in a different way, you see the world in a different way, and that's good. Also, I'm English and you shouldn't listen to me because I don't believe in impartial journalism even exists, or objective journalism even exists. But the other thing is that I work now for a news organization, Axios, which really does try very hard to be impartial and objective and facts-based. And the elephant in the room here is just Trump. It's actually almost impossible to do fact-based reporting about Trump without coming across as anti-Trump. There was this thing which just happened yesterday where he was asked about why Black people are still dying at the hands of law enforcement, and he said, quote, "So are white people, so are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way, more white people." That's like a direct quote from Donald Trump. If I had retweeted that, which is, what the President of the United States said, people would quite rightly and correctly have considered my retweet to have been a political anti-Trump, form of speech. You can't get away from that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that, that is part of why, we're seeing what looks like opinion journalism when it's actually straight ahead coverage of a very, very strange situation.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I agree that obviously there's no such thing as objective. Everything comes from a point of view. But I will say, when you read like the Trump coverage in the Financial Times, it doesn't read the same as when you read the Trump coverage in the New York Times. It does feel, even if they're obviously reporting on what's happening, and it's impossible to report on what's happening with Trump and not make him look bad because he does that to himself. But you don't necessarily get the sense that the author is trying to make a political point. And I just feel like in a lot of these larger US papers, you do see that.
Mm. Maybe so, but then you see a lot of criticism of so-called both sides journalism, which bends over backwards for that fairness, which may not ultimately be fair. A lot of it has to do with what your own political perspective is, what you're seeking in the news coverage, or what you think is maybe fair or not. I mean, when National Public Radio, which I think similarly tries to be very, very, very straight ahead and, trying to sort of get different perspectives, maybe to a fault at times, there's a ton of criticism of that. So I don't know. We're in a very contentious, polarized environment, and you can't win.
Someone was saying, I think it was John Thornton again.
Let's do this in the next segment, because we will continue, but we just need a little ad break.
Related to it. All right.
Okay.
It says here, let
Emily.
Emily speak.
Yes, I'm letting Emily speak. I'm letting Emily speak. I'm just going to. I just wanted
All I
to
was going to say
take a
is,
course breath.
sorry. All I was going to say is that when I was listening to John Thornton again at the Texas Tribune, which I feel like we should talk about more because someone asked about online journalism models that work, whatever. But he was just saying that things are so, well, he wasn't saying, I'm saying things are so crazy now that people hear the word journalism and they think it means something liberal. Like the word journalism is now associated with like left wing and liberalism, which I think is sad because, and maybe it's a function of Trump again, who is sort of like forcing the issue. When we do straight journalism, it exposes him as, you know, what he is. And so people think journalism is somehow left wing when it's just like, no, we're just exposing the truth. And the truth is this guy, this conservative in power is like, you know, a baddie, a liar, et cetera.
But this is also empirically false, right? I mean, we just had a very interesting article this week on Neiman Lab talking about a bunch of local journalistic outlets that are basically just fronts for Republicans. And there is a huge amount, and we don't see it a lot, especially not like living in New York, but there is a large amount of journalism there which really does quite explicitly carry water for the Republican Party.
Yeah, I
mean, is that journalism?
Yeah, I mean, Emily, you make a really interesting point. And I think this is something that it makes me feel very sad. And it's something that's changed a lot over my extremely long career, which is that, you know, I used to feel like, you know, I would tell people I was a journalist or reporter or editor or whatever. And, you know, you'd feel like, oh, this was going to be seen as something really great and also cool, you know, to ordinary people. And now I think you say that, and if, you know, depending on people's political perspective, they may have a very negative reaction to it for just the reasons that you're saying. And I do think that Trump has had an effect on that. When you have the president hammering away day after day about the enemy of the people and you people are scum and you know, you're all very dishonest, that's how propaganda works, right? You keep repeating it and it starts to sink in after a while. But I find that low opinion and the politicized opinion of journalism is really, it's one of the horrible things that's happened, you know, since I came into the profession, or the craft. I guess we're going to call it a craft, not a profession. But I think you're right. And it's
a deliberate thing to, it undermines that fourth thing, the voter, informing the voters, right? I mean, that's the purpose of that propaganda.
Yep.
It's very
absolutely.
I want to grab a few of the questions that people are asking here. Esty Van Esdale came in early on. We want to get to this one and saying, are the hedge funds the only buyers who can afford to take on the chain's debt? And I love this question because I get to nerd out, and Anna and I get to nerd out about like capital stacks and bankruptcy. In the case of Chatham buying McClatchy, Chatham was the largest debt holder, and they refused to just wipe out the debt. They basically converted that debt to equity, and so they took it over. And so it was much cheaper for them to take it over than it would have been for anyone else. So in that sense, you know, the debt does come into play. McClatchy was in bankruptcy. The question which I have for Margaret is, one of the great things about capitalism is that we do have this wonderful process called Chapter 11, where you get to wipe out a huge number of debts and start afresh and you know, build anew. Have you seen any local news organization really take advantage of Chapter 11, or is it more the case that you had things which were historically profitable, that the owners would dividend out lots of profits for themselves, and then when they stopped being profitable, they just gave up, and there haven't been a huge amount of debts? Like, is this something that the bankruptcy process can conceivably help with?
I mean, I think conceivably that Chapter 11 should be able to help with this, but you know, as you suggest, I don't think there's been much of an example of it. You know, it's astonishing to me that still that, the reason McClatchy got into so much trouble probably is that they bought the Knight Ridder chain at the top of the worst possible time you could buy a big newspaper chain, 2006, at the very top of the market, paid $4 billion for a chain that was much bigger than it itself was, and then took on $2 billion in debt. And so, that has crippled it. And then, of course, 2008 came along and the whole thing fell off a cliff. So, there's nothing about those economics that can work. And go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the other issues I know with McClatchy was their pension liabilities. And this is one issue you do have with papers that have been around for a long time as well, is that, back in the day, you have a unionized labor force, you can offer these types of pensions, and now they've just essentially become unsustainable.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
I really did want to ask the union question, because this is like Slate money, I think is fair to say, has historically been a pretty sort of pro-union shop. We think unions are good in most countries, in most industries. Whenever I talk to anyone in the news industry who's in management, they within about 55 seconds start complaining about the unions. You mentioned the unions in your book without a great deal of love. Is there any way in which the unions have been remotely helpful or can be helpful, or are they an obstacle to making local news work?
I think they actually have been helpful because they've helped keep some of the journalists employed and being treated reasonably well, so that they stay in the profession. So at this time when their ownership has become so brutal, I think that the unions have been extremely important and overall positive, at least the newspaper guild. I mean, I've been on every side of this thing. I've been a member of the newspaper guild. I've negotiated against the newspaper guild, and then, I'm sort of removed from the whole thing now because I write about it. But, I think they serve a very good purpose. And, I don't think they can be blamed for holding back success, financial success in these companies. I really don't.
We got a question from Peter David Falk asking about the online-only news organizations, which are coming up in many places to try and provide an alternative. You mentioned one in Western New York, which I've already forgotten what it was called.
Yeah, Investigative Post.
But you do cover this in your book, but like your thesis, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, is they do very good work, but it in no way can replace the kind of societal functions that all of these local newspapers did. Is that fair? And are any of these local online places unionized?
Yes, some of them are. Some of them are beginning to be. I think I would tweak what you just said a little bit. I think they do very good work. Some of them are excellent. It is difficult to make them scale. When you've had a newspaper in basically every small city, every region, even small towns, and they've started to go out of business, the likelihood that you're going to have a philanthropically or member-supported, nonprofit news organization that's going to sort of fill the gap is very unlikely. Capitalism scales well, and this particular thing, doesn't. It doesn't, but I think they are probably the most hopeful thing that we've seen come along. And, if there's a solution to this local news problem, the digital only and particularly the nonprofits are going to be a huge part of the solution.
I guess I was curious there in terms of.
I was thinking.
I was just going to say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. I was thinking about how journalism is this basically it's a private industry, but it serves an immense public good. And there are a bunch of industries like this, right? There's like healthcare. Maybe you could argue that like the aerospace industry is one such industry. Anyway, those kinds of industries you would think would get lots of support from the federal government, state government, and local government. I mean, what are the chances of this? Is there a way to make that work? Because it kind of seems like that's a scalable thing to do. Like small businesses in little small towns in the middle of America are surviving a lot of the times because the Small Business Administration steps in and gives these places loans. Like we're already at a federal level, like helping these little places a lot in that regard. So why not do this with journalism too?
Yeah, well, I guess it's something that's being discussed more and more now. The reason that it's never gotten much traction in the past is that news organizations and journalists have really not wanted to ever advocate for federal funding because they felt like it would diminish and cut into their independence. You know, if your funding is being supplied by the very people that you're covering critically, wouldn't that encourage you to pull your punches? So there's that, kind of push and pull. But, we're desperate now, and maybe it's time to look at it more seriously and to try to build some safeguards into it so that it could work.
Although I have to jump in here and say that I have to jump in here and say that the Voice of America, which has been a very successful independent news organization with a lot of built-in safeguards, has now just managed, like Trump has managed to come in and just dismantle all of those safeguards in a matter of like a couple of months, something like that. Like right now is exactly the time that this solution seems to not work.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, that's true. But then I guess you can look at, the BBC or, moving outside the realm of journalism for a second, libraries, these are that they get government funding, but, we don't expect local politicians to be telling us what books can be on the shelves, but just wait, it may get worse. We seem to be heading in that direction. So.
Or you could think about academia. I mean, researchers and universities get tons of money from the federal government, and I hope are doing good work and not being influenced. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, but I do think there's definitely some real danger there. I mean, I think there's a reason, because I think the thing is when people talk about government funding, I do often think it's with this idea of an ideal government. And we've clearly seen that we very often do not have an ideal government. So you would need to create a system that in any situation, including the one we're currently in, would work. And I'm not entirely sure how you do that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, the other thing that worries me about that is that, when you start thinking about, how are we going to arrange for government to be kept out of this process? And let's make sure we do it right. That is a long time consuming process that's full of bureaucracy. And meanwhile, like every week, these organizations, lots of outlets are going out of business. So by the time it gets figured out, it may be too late. And that worries me.
Yeah, I think this was a solution which did work at the Voice of America. It did work at the BBC. And I think in both of those cases, it has started to fail. Those of us who've been paying attention to the BBC chart to know that is on extremely rocky ground right now and probably won't survive. But I think this is about as much time as we have time for. We should get this numbers round in here because I know that we all have numbers. Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, wait, I wrote this down. My number has letters in it. Stand by. Okay, ready? BCLQ
is this about Twitter?
2KG. DY, GIRS, QTZQ, 2N0, YRF, 2YN, no, 2Y93P, 83KKF, JHX, 0WLH. Yes, Felix,
Will you double my money? I want you to double my money, Emily. Will you do that for me?
Yes, we are taping. It is Wednesday. And right before we were taping, the Twitter accounts of Joe Biden, Elon Musk, the Square app, who else do we know? Bill Gates were hacked.
Kanye West, you name it.
Really? And they all displayed a message.
Benjamin Netanyahu, weirdly.
With a Bitcoin address saying, if you send me if you send me what, $1,000 in Bitcoin, I'll send you back $2,000. And people send money. I mean, people sent money. So anyway, as of this taping, we don't know kind of like what happened, if this was like a regular hack or Twitter was compromised.
It clearly was not a regular hack. There was something
it sounds
high
like a
level
movie
about it.
to me.
I blame the North
Like the plot of
Koreans.
a movie, right? Yeah.
Margaret, what's your number?
300 million. So
That's a good one.
I mentioned that McClatchy paid $4 billion plus $2 billion in debt when it bought the Knight Ridder chain. And now the sort of estimated value of the McClatchy papers in toto is 300 million. So you do the math, it's a lot less.
My number is 0, and I'm gonna change my number. I'm gonna do a last minute switcheroo here because there's a question coming in from Laurel Hellesine saying, what does enrollment in higher education journalism programs look like nationally? And my answer to that is, I don't know, but it should be 0. I don't. Like this. Don't go to J school, people. It's like we've just spent an entire episode talking about how miserable this profession is, and it is entirely possible, as many of us know, to do incredibly good journalism without going to J school, and there are much better ways to create good journalists. This is my view. I'm not sure if you agree, Margaret.
Not entirely.
Anna, what's your number?
My number is 12. That is the number of public hearings and testimony that established that ABS-CBN, which is the largest TV network in the Philippines, that's the number of hearings that established that it had not violated any legal provisions, and yet its charter has been revoked, so it is no longer going to be able to broadcast in the Philippines. And this is kind of another example. This is something I think you see often when you have authoritarian leaders like Rodrigo Duterte and they want to silence the news. This is one of the ways they tend to do it, is they use these kind of little legal maneuvers. And I just think as we think about how kind of journalism and media, everything moves forward, I think it's just important to remember that.
Yeah, news gets disappeared. It has been disappeared across the Philippines, across Russia, across Brazil. In Brazil, they had this very easy lever they could pull, actually, going back to the discussion about state funding of news. There was this law which basically said that the government had to take out ads in all of the local newspapers to publish all of the banners. I don't know what the hell. Anyway, the government wound up effectively funding local newspapers in much the same way as the political races effectively fund local TV stations, because they, in the United States, because they spend so much money every election cycle on campaign ads. And then, but because the government was in charge of that, they could just take it away, and they did. And suddenly a lot of news in Brazil just evaporated. So when you see news evaporating, sometimes it is the fault of Twitter and Facebook and Google, and sometimes it is the fault of governments, and sometimes it's hard to tell, but this one is easy. That's a depressing note to end on, isn't it, really? I'm just gonna say that we should invite Margaret's cat to come in and come up with a slightly less depressing number.
We'll rearrange it. We won't end on my number in the actual podcast.
Exactly.
Margaret, what's your cat's name?
Oh, can you see the cat?
We saw the cat.
Sometimes.
Oh, really? Well, the cat's name is Ricochet. Because when he was young, and he is no longer young, he used to bounce off the walls. And so that he's Ricochet. But, he feels now that name is a little too evocative because, guns, bullets and everything. So he now wants to be known now as Rick O'Shea.
Good Irish name, then.
Yeah, good Irish name.
So on which note, to Margaret Sullivan, thank you so much for coming on this show. To your aging cat, Mr. Rick O'Shea, thank you for being in the background. to the whole crew who managed to put this live show together. And I can tell you that live shows are much more work than normal shows, and live shows during a pandemic are much more work than normal live shows. You are all amazing. Faith Smith, Jessamine Molly, and Britt, the amazing question wrangler. We love you. You're great. Thank you to all of you for making this happen. Thank you, all the Slate Plus members who were tuning in live for supporting journalism. It's an important thing. We will be back next week with a show with Lee Buchheit and Mitu Gulati, and we're going to nerd out about sovereign debt.
So great.
It's going to be awesome. It's Anna and my dream come true, and that is coming up next week on Slate Money. Okay, we haven't finished. We now need to do the introduction. And this is the bit where, historically and always, we ask Jessamine Molly to tell us what the name of the show is, because she is very good at that. And she has just jumped into the chat and said, quote, "We didn't get anything better than ghosting the news." So that's what it's going to be.
All right.
All right.
Great.
Hello and welcome to the Ghosting the News episode of Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance news of the week. It's a heavy media edition this week because not only do we have the three normal journalists who are always on this show, that is myself, Felix Salmon of Axios. We have Emily Peck of HuffPost.
Hello.
We have Anna Szymanski of Breaking Views.
Hello.
And we don't just have a journalist special guest. We have a meta-journalist special guest. We have Margaret Sullivan of the Washington Post. Welcome.
Thank
You write a must-read media column for the Washington Post. And then in your spare time, you write books for Columbia Global Reports. This is your opportunity. Plug your book.
Well, I've written a book about the decline of local news and what it means for our democracy, and it's called, just as this episode of Slate Money is called, Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. So, yes, my publication date was very recently, and check it out. It's a brief and breezy read.
It is a brief and breezy read. I can recommend it, and we are going to be covering a lot of what you cover in that book in this episode. We're going to talk about the decline of local newspapers. We're going to talk a little bit about these hedge funds who are buying them up. We're going to talk about democracy. We're going to talk about bias in news reporting. I believe, Emily Peck, that we are going to get dragged in a little bit into the debate about the discourse and Barry Weiss, if you can believe it. We are going to talk about unions. We are going to talk about whether news should be publicly funded. We have so much going on, and I promised myself that this wouldn't just be a media navel-gazing show, but it does seem to have turned into a media navel-gazing show. There's lots of media on this show for all of you media nerds. I hope you enjoy it. It's all coming up on Slate Money.